The wind was a predator, howling low and mournful across the frozen expanse, its icy breath carrying grains of snow that slashed at exposed skin like knives. Rylan pulled his scarf higher over his face, his breath condensing into a fine mist that clung to the thick fur lining of his hood. Each step crunched with deliberate weight, his boots sinking into the brittle crust of ice that stretched as far as the horizon. This was no place for the weak-hearted, nor the unprepared. He adjusted the pack strapped to his back, the weight of it pressing against his spine with the promise of survival, tools, thermal blankets, a dwindling supply of rations. The faint hum of his personal heater buzzed against his chest, an anchor of warmth in an otherwise unrelenting void. Rylan had lived alone on Arctera V for nearly 3 years, surveying its unforgiving terrain for minerals and compounds that could one day feed the ever-hungry industries of Earth's colonies. It was a job for the desperate or the damned. He wasn't sure which category he belonged to anymore. Overhead, the sky bled color. Shades of green and violet ribbons twisted in slow, hypnotic patterns, illuminating the nightless world with a spectral glow. The effect was beautiful, almost surreal, and it never failed to unnerve him. Beauty here was always a prelude to something dangerous. The faint chirp from his scanner cut through the keening wind. He froze mid-step, his pulse quickening. The device, strapped to his wrist, glowed faintly in the dim light, its readout spiking with irregular blips. Movement, but not his. Rylan's gloved hand hovered over the scanner as he adjusted its sensitivity. The signal strengthened, a cluster of faint heat signatures, small and erratic. Animal, he thought instinctively, though the notion felt wrong. Nothing survived out here, not in this kind of cold. The few creatures adapted to Arctera's relentless freeze burrowed deep underground, their lives measured in slow, hibernating beats. And yet, the scanner insisted. Curiosity warred with caution, but curiosity always won. It was the same impulse that had driven him to take this assignment in the first place, leaving behind the crowded stations orbiting Earth for this empty, unyielding place. He tightened his grip on the reinforced handle of his ice axe and adjusted his heading toward the signal. The journey took longer than it should have, his path winding through jagged outcroppings of black, crystalline rock and over frozen ridges that threatened to crumble underfoot. The wind grew sharper, tugging at his coat with greedy fingers, but the signal only grew stronger. Then he saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a dark smear against the white, a shape half buried in snow, its edges blurred by frost and shadow. Rylan squinted, his steps slowing as he approached, the sense of wrongness thickening in his chest. It wasn't an animal. The figure was humanoid, though its form was alien in ways that made his stomach twist. Its skin, visible through rents in a tattered suit, shimmered faintly under the auroras, its texture like fractured glass or frozen water. Long, slender limbs curled inward protectively, and a cascade of something that might have been hair, white, silver, or both, fanned out across the snow. Rylan crouched, his gloved fingers trembling as he reached for the figure's shoulder. He hesitated, his breath clouding between them. It was alive, barely. The faint rise and fall of its chest sent a jolt through him, and he pressed 2 fingers against what he hoped was its neck. The pulse, if it could be called that, was erratic, a fluttering rhythm too quick, too alien. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, his voice muffled by the scarf. The figure didn't respond. Its face, obscured by frost, was still and pale, lips slightly parted. Rylan shook his head, the pragmatist in him screaming to leave it. Whatever it wasn't his problem. Survival on Arctera Phi was a razor's edge, and his pack was stocked only for one. But then the figure shivered, or rather, its whole body convulsed. A faint, keening sound escaped its lips, and Rylan's resolve broke. With a grunt, he slid his arms under the figure's surprisingly light body and hoisted it up. The motion was awkward. Its limbs hung limply, one arm brushing against his pack, and he could feel the unnatural chill radiating through the layers of his coat. The trek back to the shelter was brutal. The added weight slowed him, and the wind grew more vicious, as if resenting his choice to defy it. His muscles screamed in protest, and by the time the familiar outline of his dome-shaped shelter appeared on the horizon, he was gasping for air. He stumbled through the entrance, collapsing onto the metal floor as the hatch sealed behind him with a hiss. The sudden stillness was deafening, the warmth inside suffocating after the endless cold. Rylan lay there for a moment, his breath coming in ragged bursts, before he turned his attention back to the figure. Carefully, he laid it out on the insulated cot in the corner. Up close, the alien nature of its appearance was even more pronounced. The crystalline patterns on its skin seemed to shimmer faintly, and the tips of its fingers ended in sharp, translucent points. Rylan grabbed a thermal blanket from his pack, draping it over the figure's form. He activated the medical scanner in his shelter, a crude device but better than nothing, and held it over the figure's chest. The screen flickered, struggling to process the unfamiliar biology. Unknown. The word blinked across the scanner's display, and Rylan bit back a curse. The figure stirred then, its head rolling to the side, and for a moment its eyes fluttered open. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, glowing softly, like embers trapped beneath glass. "Warmth," it whispered, the word a ghost of sound, fragile and broken. Rylan froze, his pulse thundering in his ears. It spoke. The soft hum of machinery filled the air, the only constant in the tenuous calm of the shelter. Rylan sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor, the edge of his coat still wet from melted snow, his gaze fixed on the figure lying on his cot. He had wrapped the alien woman in his last emergency thermal blanket, layering extra insulation beneath her fragile form. Despite his efforts, her crystalline skin still shimmered faintly, refracting the dim light in the shelter like a fractured prism. He should have been cataloging the day's samples or checking the automated drills he had deployed miles away. Instead, he found himself captivated by the rise and fall of her chest, erratic and shallow, a life so close to the brink, yet clinging on with an inexplicable determination. Outside, the wind howled, battering against the reinforced steel walls of the shelter. The storm hadn't let up. Arctera V, in its infinite cruelty, wasn't content to allow him even a moment's reprieve. He stood, stretching his stiff limbs, and moved to the console near the back of the room. The interface flickered to life, casting a pale glow over his face. The station's systems were rudimentary, patched together with salvaged components over years of isolation. He navigated to the environmental readout. Outside temperatures had plummeted to an unbearable -82 degrees Celsius, and the wind speeds were nearing 150 kilometers per hour. No chance of venturing out again until it passed. Rylan sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. His supplies were thin, his oxygen scrubbers overdue for maintenance, and now he had a mysterious, possibly dying alien on his hands. As if things hadn't been precarious enough. Why couldn't it have been a cache of minerals, he muttered, glancing over his shoulder at her still form. As if in response, the shelter's scanner emitted a soft beep. Rylan turned back to the console, his brow furrowing as he adjusted the display. The scanner had been picking up odd readings since he brought her inside. Faint energy spikes, like whispers in the electromagnetic spectrum. He initially dismissed them as interference from the storm, but now the patterns were becoming more distinct, almost rhythmic. "What the hell is this?" he murmured. The spikes centered around her. Whatever she wasn't just alien in biology. She radiated something the scanner couldn't identify, an energy signature that didn't belong on this frozen world. She stirred again hours later, her body jerking weakly against the blanket. Rylan was crouched nearby, fiddling with a crude makeshift heater he had rigged to amplify the warmth around her cot. At the sound, he looked up sharply, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They glowed faintly, twin orbs of molten amber, swirling with an almost hypnotic depth. It wasn't a reflection of the shelter's lights. They seemed to radiate their own subtle luminance, like embers buried beneath ice. "Easy," Rylan said, holding up his hands in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "You're safe here." Her gaze darted around the small space, taking in the patchwork walls and flickering lights before returning to him. When she spoke, her voice was soft, barely more than a rasp, and carried an otherworldly cadence. "Where?" "You're in my shelter," he replied. "I found you out there. You were almost gone." Her brow furrowed and she struggled to sit up, wincing as she moved. Rylan moved instinctively to stop her. "Hey, take it easy. You're in no shape to—" Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. The contact sent a strange, tingling sensation up his arm, and her eyes narrowed. "You touched me," she said, her voice laced with something between accusation and disbelief. "Yeah, well, you were dying," Rylan said, trying to mask his unease. "Didn't have much of a choice." She released him suddenly, her expression softening, though confusion still clouded her features. She sank back against the cot, her movements slow and deliberate, as if testing her own strength. "What's your name?" Rylan asked after a long pause. For a moment, she seemed to consider the question as if weighing the implications of answering. Finally, she spoke. "Lysara." "Lysara," he repeated, letting the unfamiliar name roll off his tongue. "I'm Rylan. You mind telling me what you were doing out there? Not exactly a good place for a stroll." She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted to the ceiling, her amber eyes dimming slightly as though retreating inward. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "My ship. There was a storm. A crash." Her voice faltered. "Everything else is unclear." Rylan leaned back on his heels, his instincts prickling. Amnesia? Or something else? The next few hours passed in tense silence. Lysara drifted in and out of sleep, her breathing still uneven, while Rylan worked tirelessly to stabilize the failing heater and patch a minor leak in the oxygen scrubbers. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, and the shelter's walls groaned under the pressure. At one point, Rylan ventured into the small storage compartment to inventory his remaining supplies. Food was dangerously low, reduced to a handful of ration packs and a tin of nutrient paste he'd been saving for emergencies. He cursed under his breath, his mind spinning with calculations. By the time he returned to the main room, Lysara was sitting upright, her movements slow but more deliberate. She was examining her own arm, her crystalline skin catching the dim light and refracting it in faint rainbows. "What are you?" Rylan asked before he could stop himself. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she said nothing, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken tension. Finally she replied, "I am not like you." "Yeah, I gathered that much." Rylan crossed his arms. "But if you expect me to keep you alive, I need answers." Her gaze hardened, and for the first time, he caught a glimpse of something deeper in her eyes, a guarded intensity, as if she were calculating how much to reveal. "I don't know if you'll want those answers, human." Rylan frowned, but before he could press further, the shelter's scanner emitted another soft beep. He turned to the console, his heart sinking as he read the new data. Another signal. Faint but growing stronger, not from the storm, and not from the planet. Something, or someone, was coming. The shelter's scanner continued its low, rhythmic beeping, each pulse cutting through the silence like a ticking clock. Rylan hovered over the console, his jaw clenched as he studied the display. The signal was stronger now, its origin a mystery suspended in the swirling chaos of Arctera V's storm. "What does it mean?" Lysara's voice broke the tension, her tone sharper than before. She had risen from the cot, the thermal blanket draped loosely over her shoulders. Her glowing amber eyes were steady, focused on the console, and for the first time, she seemed more present, less fragile, less on the brink. Rylan tapped a few buttons, magnifying the waveform. "It's a transmission, but it's not local. Definitely not from my equipment." He paused, casting her a wary glance. "Could it be from your ship?" Lysara stepped closer, her movements deliberate and silent, like a predator approaching prey. "Number this frequency. It doesn't match." Her eyes narrowed, her crystalline skin shimmering faintly as she spoke. "It's not mine, but it's familiar." "Familiar how?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her gaze flicked to the small viewport embedded in the shelter's wall, beyond which the storm raged like a living beast. "It's a search pattern. Someone or something is scanning for life." Ryland's stomach tightened. He knew what search patterns looked like, the telltale oscillations of a signal designed to probe, to find, to hunt. "Who would be looking for you?" Lysara's expression darkened, the faint glow in her eyes dimming, as if shadows had passed over them. "Not allies." The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, the wind howling as if to drown out any thought of escape. The shelter trembled under its fury, and Ryland felt the weight of his isolation more acutely than ever. The fragile bubble of warmth and air that protected him now housed an unknown entity, and now it seemed a new threat loomed. He turned back to the console, his fingers flying across the controls. "If someone's scanning for life, they'll pick up this shelter eventually. The shielding isn't enough to block this kind of sweep." Lysara moved to his side, her presence unsettlingly quiet. "You should leave." Ryland froze mid-gesture, his eyes snapping to hers. "Leave? In this storm? You'd be dead in minutes without the shelter. Better me than both of us." Her tone was calm, almost cold, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. Fear, laced with resolve. He shook his head. "Not happening. I didn't drag you out of the snow just to toss you back to whatever's out there." Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, her voice low. "You don't understand. They'll kill you too." Ryland leaned back, crossing his arms. "Then maybe you should start explaining who they are." And the explanation, when it came, was fragmented, disjointed memories and vague admissions. Lysara's kind were not like humans. They lived on the edge of energy and matter, their forms both fragile and powerful. She was part of something larger, though whether it was a civilization or a collective she didn't say. What she did reveal was chilling. "They don't forgive weakness," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I was sent to survey this place. Arctera V. A mistake, perhaps, or a test." Her glowing eyes fixed on him, sharp and unyielding. "When I crashed, I became irrelevant, an anomaly to be corrected." "You mean eliminated," Ryland said grimly. She nodded. "They'll send drones first to confirm my death. Then, if I'm alive, they'll come themselves." Ryland cursed under his breath, pacing the small space of the shelter. His mind raced, calculating the odds, the risks, the impossibility of it all. He had no weapons aside from his ice axe and a modified welding torch. The shelter's defenses were laughable, its walls designed to keep out the cold, not intruders. Lysara watched him, her expression unreadable. "You should still leave," she said softly. He stopped pacing, turning to face her. "Not an option. If these drones are coming, we'll deal with them." "We?" Her voice was skeptical, almost mocking. "You don't even understand what you're up against." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I know this planet. I've survived storms, avalanches, freezing temperatures that would kill most people in minutes. I'm not leaving." For a moment they stared at each other, the silence thick with unspoken tension. Then, to his surprise, Lysara's lips twitched into the faintest semblance of a smile. "You're either brave or foolish," she said. "Probably both." The preparations were minimal, driven more by desperation than strategy. Ryland scavenged the shelter for anything remotely useful. Tools, spare parts, even the battery pack from the emergency beacon. Lysara, though still weak, offered insights into the drone's potential capabilities. They were fast, relentless, and precise. but they relied on technology, heat signatures, movement, energy emissions. "They don't think like you or me," she said as she helped him rig a crude EMP device using the shelter's backup generator. "They only calculate." "Good," Rylan muttered. "Machines have blind spots. We just need to find them." Hours passed, marked only by the flickering of the shelter's lights and the growing tension in the air. The storm outside began to ease, the winds dying down to a low, mournful wail. The silence that followed was almost worse, an ominous void that seemed to stretch forever. And then the scanner chirped again. "They're here," Lysera said quietly, her voice tight. Rylan checked the display. The signal was close now. Too close. He grabbed his ice axe, the crude weapon feeling pitifully inadequate in his hands. "Stay behind me," he said, glancing back at her. But Lysera didn't move to hide. Instead, she stood straighter, the faint glow in her skin intensifying. "I'm not as helpless as I seem," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge. Before Rylan could reply, the shelter's exterior sensor detected movement, fast, skimming over the snowdrifts. The first drone appeared in the viewport, a sleek, angular shape with glowing red optics. It was hunting, and it had found them. The drone hovered outside the shelter like a phantom, its red optics scanning the structure with mechanical precision. Inside, Rylan stood motionless, his breath shallow, gripping the ice axe tightly. Lysera stood just behind him, her glowing amber eyes locked on the viewport, her crystalline skin shimmering faintly in the dim light. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the faint hum of the drone's propulsion system. Then, as if deciding, the drone emitted a pulse of light that rippled across the shelter's exterior. The console behind Rylan flared to life, warning alarms blaring. "They're mapping us," Lysera said, her voice low but steady. "No kidding," Rylan muttered. His fingers danced over the console, trying to activate the crude EMP device they had rigged. But as he worked, a cold dread settled over him. This drone was just the beginning. Lysera stepped closer, her presence calm, yet unnervingly intense. "When it breaches, I can slow it down," she said. "You? How?" Her gaze flicked to him briefly, unreadable. "I told you, I'm not helpless." Before Rylan could question her further, the drone's hum intensified. A sharp crack echoed through the air as its energy weapon struck the shelter's door, melting a glowing fissure into the reinforced metal. Sparks flew, and the acrid scent of scorched steel filled the room. "It's coming in," Rylan shouted. He slammed the EMP activation switch, flooding the room with a high-pitched whine. The drone outside faltered, its optics flickering, its propulsion system sputtering. For a moment, it seemed to work, but then a second signal surged, overriding the EMP's disruption. The drone stabilized, its optics locking onto the breach it had created. Lysera moved swiftly. She raised a hand, and for the first time, Rylan saw it, an ethereal glow radiating from her palm, a strange, otherworldly energy that shimmered like liquid light. The drone hesitated, its systems clearly reacting to whatever Lysera was emitting. "What the hell are you—" Rylan began, but his words were cut off as Lysera unleashed the energy in a blinding pulse. The drone was thrown back, crashing into the snow outside. Its form sparked and twitched before going still. The room was plunged into silence again, save for the hiss of melting snow dripping through the breach in the door. Rylan stared at her, his heart pounding. "What was that?" Lysera lowered her hand, her expression unreadable. "A fraction of what I am." In the aftermath left Rylan with more questions than answers. He worked quickly to seal the breach, using scrap metal and insulation foam to patch the damaged door. Lysera remained silent, watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. When he finally turned to face her, his voice was sharp. "You want to explain what just happened? That wasn't exactly standard-issue alien biology." She hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "What you saw was a defense mechanism," she said slowly. "My kind are built to survive in ways you wouldn't understand. Try me." Lysara's glowing eyes dimmed slightly, her crystalline skin refracting faint colors in the low light. The energy you saw is part of what sustains me. It's tied to my essence, my being. It's also why they're hunting me. Ryland's brow furrowed. You mean the drones? They're after your… what? Your power? In part. Her voice was distant, almost hollow. But it's more than that. They can't allow me to exist. Not like this. Why not? Her gaze dropped, and for a moment she seemed almost fragile again, the glow in her eyes dimming further. Because I'm not supposed to be here. I was supposed to die with the crash. My survival is inconvenient. Ryland opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the console behind him lit up again. Another signal. Stronger this time. They've sent more, Lysara said, her voice tight. Ryland cursed, moving to the console. The display showed multiple contacts approaching rapidly. He counted 3, then 5, then 7 drones converging on their location. This is bad, he muttered. They'll tear the shelter apart. Lysara stepped closer, her expression resolute. We can't stay here. They'll overwhelm us. And go where? Ryland snapped. The storm might have eased, but it's still lethal out there. This shelter's the only thing keeping us alive. Lysara's glowing eyes met his, unyielding. Not if we stay. We have to move. Now. The decision to leave was not one Ryland made lightly. He packed quickly, grabbing the few supplies he had left, ration packs, a portable heater, and a small oxygen tank. Lysara moved with purpose, her strength seemingly restored, though her crystalline skin still shimmered with an otherworldly fragility. They stepped out into the snow, the biting cold immediately cutting through their layers. The storm had subsided, leaving behind a desolate landscape of ice and silence. The sky above was dark, swirling with faint auroras that painted the horizon in ghostly hues. This way, Lysara said, pointing toward a distant ridge. Ryland hesitated. What's over there? An old facility, she said. It was part of my survey mission. There might be something we can use. The journey was brutal. The snow was thick, the wind biting, and every step was a struggle against the unforgiving terrain. Ryland's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and his limbs ached with the effort of carrying their supplies. Lysara moved ahead, her glowing eyes scanning the horizon, her movements eerily fluid despite the harsh conditions. As they reached the ridge, a new sound broke through the silence, a low, mechanical hum. Ryland turned, his heart sinking. The drones had found them. And the first drone descended swiftly, its red optics gleaming in the dark. Ryland swung his ice axe as it approached, managing to clip one of its appendages. The drone faltered but didn't fall. Lysara raised her hand again, the same ethereal glow emanating from her palm. This time, the pulse she released was stronger, brighter, and it struck the drone with enough force to send it crashing into the snow. But more were coming. As the second drone appeared, something changed. Lysara stumbled, her glowing energy flickering. She gasped, clutching her side, and Ryland realized for the first time that her crystalline skin was fractured, faint cracks spreading like spiderwebs. "What's wrong?" he shouted, grabbing her arm to steady her. "I can't sustain it," she said through gritted teeth. "Not for long." Ryland's mind raced. They couldn't keep fighting like this, not out in the open. Then Lysara looked at him, her expression hardening. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "The facility, it's not just a shelter, it's a beacon. If we activate it, it might draw them away from us." Ryland's eyes narrowed. "And who else will it draw?" Lysara didn't answer. The revelation hung heavy between them as the next drone descended, its optics blazing red. The ridge overlooked an expanse of ice fields veined with jagged black rock, glistening like obsidian in the pale aurora light. The cold seemed to deepen with every step, gnawing through layers of insulation, as if the planet itself sought to consume them. Ryland tightened his grip on the ice axe, his breath coming in shallow bursts, his eyes darting between Lysara and the approaching drones. The facility she had mentioned was still out of sight, but her pace didn't falter, her movement steady despite the visible fractures on her crystalline skin. She clutched her side, her other arm hanging stiffly at her side. Though she tried to mask it, Rylan could see she was weakening. "How far?" he asked, his voice tight, pushing against the howl of the wind. Lysara didn't answer immediately. Her gaze stayed locked on the horizon, her glowing eyes dimmer now, as if the energy that sustained her was draining away. "Not far," she finally said, though her tone carried the weight of uncertainty. Rylan cursed under his breath. He didn't trust the nebulous promise of the facility. He didn't trust Lysara either, not entirely. But what choice did he have? They moved quickly, the relentless wind tearing at their clothes, their boots crunching through snow that seemed to go on forever. The drone hums grew louder behind them, a mechanical promise of destruction that sent adrenaline coursing through Rylan's veins. "Here!" Lysara called suddenly, stopping in front of a fissure in the ice. Beneath it, a faint metallic structure gleamed, half buried in frost. Rylan frowned. "That's the facility?" "It's what's left of it." The entrance was a narrow hatch, frozen shut and almost invisible against the ice. Rylan worked to clear it, smashing at the frost with his axe until his arms ached. Lysara stood nearby, her focus divided between him and the sky. "They're coming closer," she warned, her voice strained. "I'm moving as fast as I can," Rylan snapped, though he wasn't sure if it was anger or fear driving his words. Finally, the hatch gave way with a groan, revealing a dark passage that plunged into the depths of the ice. A rush of stale air greeted them, thick with the metallic tang of abandonment. Lysara didn't hesitate. She slid inside, her movements swift despite her injuries. Rylan followed, his breath catching as the hatch slammed shut behind them. Inside, the facility was a maze of dark corridors and frost-coated machinery, every surface crusted with ice. Emergency lights flickered weakly, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the walls. Rylan's boots crunched against the frozen floor, the sound echoing like gunshots in the stillness. "This place has power?" he asked, his voice low. "Barely," Lysara replied, her breath visible in the cold air. "It's running on reserves, but the beacon will work." They moved deeper into the structure, passing rooms filled with ancient equipment, their functions long forgotten. Rylan felt the weight of the place pressing down on him, a claustrophobic tension that made his skin crawl. As they entered what appeared to be the central chamber, Lysara stopped abruptly. Her hand trembled as she gestured to a console embedded in the wall. "There, that's the beacon." Rylan approached it cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The console was primitive by modern standards, its interface clunky and unresponsive. He wiped away the frost and activated it, the screen flickering to life with a soft hum. "What happens if we turn it on?" he asked, glancing at Lysara. She hesitated, her glowing eyes unreadable. "It will draw the drones away. They'll focus on the signal." "That's not all, is it?" Rylan pressed. Her gaze dropped. "It may draw others as well." Rylan's stomach tightened. "You mean more of your kind?" Lysara nodded. "If they come, they'll destroy everything. Me, you, this entire facility. They won't allow any trace of my survival." Rylan stared at her, the implications sinking in. "And you want me to activate it anyway?" "It's the only way," she said quietly. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the frigid air. Rylan's mind raced, calculating the odds, weighing the risks. If he activated the beacon, they might survive the drones. But at what cost? "You're asking me to gamble with both our lives," he said, his voice hard. Lysara stepped closer, her expression desperate. "If we don't, the drones will find us here. There's no escape. At least this gives us a chance." Rylan shook his head, his frustration boiling over. A chance at what? Being hunted down by something even worse? "They won't come immediately. she said, her tone urgent. We'll have time to escape, to find shelter elsewhere. But if we stay here, we're already dead. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. The room felt colder now, the frost creeping up the walls like a living thing. You don't understand what's at stake, Lysara said, her voice softer. If they take me, they'll use what's inside me, my energy, my knowledge. They'll turn it into a weapon. It's not just about survival, Rylan. It's about stopping them from gaining that power. Her words struck a nerve, and Rylan felt the anger drain from him, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. He looked at her, really looked at her. The fractures in her crystalline skin, the flickering glow in her eyes, the way she carried herself despite the pain. You're asking me to risk everything for someone I barely know, he said finally. Yes, she replied simply. The hum of the drones grew louder, their proximity a ticking clock that counted down to their destruction. Rylan clenched his fists, his mind racing. He could walk away. Let the drones take her, save himself. It would be the rational choice, the safe choice. But as he looked at Lysara, he saw something in her eyes. A flicker of trust, of hope, of something he couldn't quite name. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. He turned back to the console, his hands shaking as he keyed in the activation sequence. The beacon flared to life, its signal bursting through the facility like a siren call. The drones outside hesitated, their hums faltering as they recalibrated. One by one they turned, moving toward the beacon's source. Lysara exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. You did the right thing, she said softly. I hope so, Rylan replied, his voice grim. But deep down, he wasn't sure. The beacon's signal hummed through the facility, its vibrations resonating in the icy walls. Outside, the drones circled like predatory shadows drawn to a dying ember. Their mechanical hums grew louder, sharper, as they converged on the central chamber. Rylan stood at the console, his fingers trembling as he toggled the final overrides. Every decision weighed heavy in his mind, a silent reckoning of choices that could lead to salvation or doom. Beside him, Lysara leaned heavily against the wall, her luminous eyes dim and flickering. How much time do we have? He asked, his voice low. Not enough, she replied, her tone hollow. The drones are adapting to the beacon. They'll breach soon. Great, Rylan muttered. His gaze darted to the entrance, reinforced but still vulnerable. Every scrape of metal or distant hum sent his nerves alight. Lysara straightened, though the effort visibly pained her. The fractures in her crystalline skin glimmered faintly, spreading like fault lines. There's something I need to tell you, she said, her voice tinged with urgency. Now? Rylan snapped, gesturing to the chaos outside. Yes, because it matters. She stepped closer, her golden eyes locking onto his. The energy inside me, it's not just a weapon, it's a key to something buried deep on this planet. Rylan frowned. What do you mean, a key? There's a vault, she said, her voice growing steadier. It contains technology my people abandoned long ago. If the drone's creators access it, they'll gain power that could reshape galaxies. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? Rylan demanded. I wasn't sure I could trust you, she admitted. But now, you need to understand. If I fall into their hands, it's over. For both of us, and for countless others. The revelation hit Rylan like a physical blow. The stakes had always been high, but now they loomed incomprehensibly large. He turned back to the console, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. How do we stop them? He asked, his voice tight. Lysara hesitated. If I release all the energy within me, I can destroy the drones and the beacon, but what? Her gaze faltered, the faint glow in her eyes dimming further. It will destroy me too. The room fell silent. Rylan's breath caught, the implications of her words sinking in. He turned to face her fully, his mind racing for alternatives. There has to be another way, he said, his tone defiant. "We can find the vault. Shut it down." "There's no time," she interrupted. "The drones won't stop, and even if we escape, they'll keep coming. This is the only way to ensure they fail." Rylan shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides. "Number I didn't drag you out of the snow just to watch you throw your life away." Lysara's expression softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You didn't just save me, Rylan. You gave me a chance to fight back, to choose how this ends." The facility shuddered as the drones intensified their assault. Sparks rained down from the ceiling, and the hum of the beacon grew distorted, warbling like a dying heartbeat. Rylan moved to the entrance, peering through the narrow viewport. The drones had formed a perimeter, their red optics scanning for weak points. One of them unleashed a concentrated beam of energy, carving through the reinforced metal with terrifying precision. "They're almost through," he said, his voice grim. Lysara stepped forward, her movements slow but purposeful. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch cold but steadying. "You need to leave." Rylan turned to her, his eyes blazing with defiance. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," she insisted. "If you stay, you'll die, and everything we've done will be for nothing." "I don't care," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You think I can just walk away, after everything?" Her gaze softened, and for a moment, the harsh reality of the situation seemed to fade. "Rylan," she said quietly, "you've already done more for me than I ever expected. But this is my fight, my choice." His throat tightened, the weight of her words choking him. He wanted to argue, to fight, to find some impossible solution. But deep down, he knew she was right. The final breach came with a deafening crash. The drones poured into the facility, their metallic forms gleaming in the flickering light. Lysara stepped forward, her posture straight despite the visible fractures spidering across her body. Rylan hesitated, his heart pounding. "I can't." "You can," she said firmly. "And you must. Go. Now." Her tone left no room for argument. Rylan clenched his jaw, his fists shaking as he turned toward the emergency exit. He forced himself to move, every step feeling like a betrayal. As he reached the threshold, he glanced back one last time. Lysara stood in the center of the chamber, her glowing energy intensifying. The light radiating from her grew brighter, casting the room in a golden haze. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying an unexpected warmth. And then she unleashed it. The explosion was blinding, a surge of energy that consumed everything in its path. The drones disintegrated instantly, their forms collapsing into shards of molten metal. The walls of the facility buckled under the force, and Rylan barely managed to dive into the snow as the structure behind him imploded. For a moment, the world was silent, the air thick with the aftermath of destruction. Rylan pushed himself to his feet, his ears ringing, his heart heavy. He turned to face the ruins, his breath catching as he saw the faint glow of Lysara's energy fading into the night. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of her sacrifice pressing down on him. She was gone. And yet, in her absence, the storm seemed to ease. The sky cleared, revealing a vast expanse of stars that stretched endlessly above. Rylan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. She had given everything to stop the threat, and now it was up to him to ensure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. The sky stretched wide and unbroken, a deep indigo canvas speckled with stars. The storm had lifted, leaving the frozen plains quiet and still, as though the planet itself were holding its breath. Rylan stood at the edge of the crater where the facility had been, his boots sinking into snow tinged faintly with ash. The bitter cold gnawed at him, but he barely felt it. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the shard of crystalline light he had retrieved from the wreckage. It was small, barely the size of his palm, but it pulsed faintly with a familiar golden glow. Lysara's essence, her final gift, or perhaps her last whisper. The memories of their time together weighed heavy on him. He could still hear her voice, see the defiant light in her eyes. She had been more than just a fleeting companion in the harsh isolation of this world. She had become something he couldn't fully define, something worth fighting for. Ryland turned away from the crater and began walking, his steps purposeful despite the exhaustion that clung to him. He had mapped a rough course toward the vault Lysara had spoken of, a place buried deep beneath the ice where secrets older than the storms lay waiting. It wasn't just about honoring her sacrifice, it was about ensuring it had meaning. If the vault's contents were as dangerous as she'd said, it couldn't be left for anyone, or anything, to exploit. The journey was grueling. The winds returned with a vengeance, tearing at his clothing and sapping his strength. His rations dwindled, the stale remnants barely enough to keep him moving. But Ryland pressed on, driven by a determination he hadn't known he possessed. At the entrance to the vault was hidden within a jagged canyon, its walls lined with frozen waterfalls that glimmered like glass. Ryland descended carefully, his every movement calculated. The ice beneath his feet was treacherous, threatening to shatter with each step. When he finally reached the bottom, he saw it, a massive door carved from an alloy that shimmered faintly even in the dim light. Strange symbols adorned its surface, their meaning lost to time. He placed a hand on the door, the cold biting into his skin even through his gloves. The shard in his pocket pulsed faintly, as though responding to his proximity. With a deep breath, Ryland pulled the shard out and held it against the door. The reaction was immediate, a burst of golden light that rippled across the surface, illuminating the symbols. The door groaned, ancient mechanisms grinding to life. Slowly, it began to open. Inside, the vault was a stark contrast to the frozen world outside. It was warm, the air thick with the hum of dormant machinery. Rows of intricate devices stretched into the distance, their designs alien and incomprehensible. Ryland moved cautiously, his eyes scanning for anything that might pose a threat. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he would recognize it when he found it. In the center of the room, he stopped. A pedestal rose from the floor, its surface smooth and unmarked. Resting atop it was a sphere of light, its radiance soft yet impossibly bright. The shard in his hand pulsed again, more urgently now. "This is it," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his instincts screaming at him to be careful. The sphere seemed to react to his presence, its light shifting subtly, almost as if it were alive. Ryland hesitated. What was he supposed to do? Destroy it? Take it? The answers felt just out of reach. And then he remembered Lysara's words. "The energy inside me. It's a key." He placed the shard on the pedestal just below the sphere. The reaction was immediate. The sphere pulsed violently, its light flaring brighter than the sun. Ryland stumbled back, shielding his eyes as the room filled with a deafening hum. The light coalesced, shrinking inward before bursting outward in a wave of warmth and silence. When Ryland opened his eyes, the sphere was gone. The pedestal was empty, its surface smooth once more. The vault felt different. The hum of the machinery had ceased, leaving an almost sacred stillness in its place. Ryland exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing. Whatever power had been locked away here, it was no longer a threat. The journey back to the surface was grueling, but Ryland moved with a sense of purpose. The storm had returned, fierce and unrelenting, but he pressed on. When he finally emerged from the canyon, the horizon was painted with the faint hues of dawn. The storm clouds parted just enough to reveal the sun, its light weak but resolute. Ryland paused, letting the moment wash over him. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the empty space where the shard had been. Lysara was gone, but her presence lingered, in the silence of the vault, in the warmth of the sun, in the man he had become. And the path ahead was uncertain. The frozen planet was as unforgiving as ever, and the galaxy beyond held its own dangers. But Ryland felt a strange sense of peace, a clarity that had eluded him before. He tightened his coat, adjusted his pack, and started walking. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was moving forward. The frozen world swallowed his footprints, but the echoes of his journey remained. A lone figure against an endless expanse, carrying the light of a sacrifice that would never fade.